this was my world. I spent many years involved with sharp bits of pointy aluminium flying through the sky. And it was quite amazing for a while that I had the responsibility for sort of thinking about the whole system. How do we keep things like this flying? And I was always amazed that every day I would have people that would come to work with me and they would worship these bits of tin. Men, generally, in case you hadn't worked that out. And it was phenomenal because they were so engaged. But for me, what I really wanted to do was understand systems like this. And that, when I made the transition away from working in this environment to then taking a deep look at the world as it is and sustainability, I used some of those principles and practices of seeing systems to help navigate me. Now, this here is an amazing picture. I don't know whether many of you would have seen it before, but that's a picture of the Earth from 6 million miles away when Voyager 1 space probe left our solar system, and Carl Sagan, the great exobiologist, said to NASA, "Turn the cameras around, we need to see what we look like." Not much. But what's been driving this little pale blue dot out there is a set of ideas that have been around for about 200 years that haven't really changed much. And that's what I would like to explore with you today. Maybe a bit of a closer view. Like what I call, here we go, Spaceship Earth. Travelling around the universe at 1 million miles an hour. And what's happening here? On the year that I was born, in 1964, there were 3.276 billion people on this planet. 6 billion, 7 billion. At the end of this month, the United Nations are saying that we'll have 7 billion people on this planet. That's a fairly significant milestone, I think. But it hasn't really stopped there. The trajectory says that by 2050, we'll see 10.1 billion people on this planet. Now, I believe this is a critical decade, probably one of the most critical decades for humanity, to really examine the ideas that sit under our behaviours and actions in the world. And for me, sustainability is more than that. I think we're talking about survival. Sorry to be so down on that, but I think it's important that we face up to where we are. Now, on the cockpit of Spaceship Earth, the high-fidelity instruments, across that combing there at the top of the cockpit, are where all the master caution lights come on and tell the pilots, whoa, we've got something serious that we need to attend to. But what's really happening? Is this the situation? Okay. One of the biggest killers in aviation is, in fact, the complacency of the aircrew. We have simulators where we throw them in the deep end and play around with virtual futures on that particular device so that we make sure that that complacency is disrupted. And we also seem to have an autopilot that is set to those 200-year-old ideas from the Industrial Revolution. And at the same time, despite the need for taking decisive action, we're sort of doing a bit of work with the deck chairs and shuffling them around. Now, what I'd like to do, though, is think about what are those indicators on Spaceship Earth telling us? And this is quite a confronting little story I'm going to tell you here, but I think everybody needs to think about this quite deeply. If we took all the mammal flesh on this planet, what we call the mammalian zoomass, blue whales, cats, pigs, dogs, lions, tigers, bandicoots, ocelots, and human beings. If we went back 10,000 years ago and we took that mammalian zoomass and put it in a pile somewhere, and then we separated out from that pile the human beings and our domesticated animals for food, beasts of burden, and for companionship. 10,000 years ago, humanity and our domestic animals represented less than 0.1% of all that mammal flesh. In At the start of the Industrial Revolution, where we really got into the act of digging up black stuff and pumping it up and setting fire to it and giving us all this amazing energy, that had crept up to about 10 to 12%. Today, it's quite interesting. The sum total of human flesh and our domesticated animals on this planet right now represents somewhere between 96 and 98% of all the mammal flesh on the planet. And we've got to start asking questions about how much material and how much energy we're using to maintain that. And that's at 7 billion people. We're talking about 10.1 billion people moving into the future. At the same time, one of the other indicators on Spaceship Earth is telling us that 80% of all people on this planet are living at or below one or more of the Millennium Development Goal targets, which I think everybody would agree are fairly reasonable targets for every human being on this planet. Access to clean water, education, good healthcare, shelter, and all of the other elements of the Millennium Development Goals. And at the same time, things are getting better and better for fewer and fewer people, and worse for more and more people. And that's all happening faster and faster. It doesn't seem to be slowing down. What about the environment that Spaceship Earth is operating in? I mentioned earlier about the importance of having high-fidelity instruments that really tell us the best rendering of the truth possible. The ecological footprint is one of those high-fidelity instruments that we use. It looks at the human appropriation of the net primary productivity of nature and makes an assessment of just how much of that we're using. And on the 27th of September this year, if we'd started with a clean slate at the start of the year, by the 27th of September, we had used up 1 planet's worth of ecosystem services. That says that by the end of the year, we'll use about 1.4, maybe 1.5 planets worth. Now that's collectively. Here in Australia, on our little part of the cabin on Spaceship Earth, we're using about 4.5 planets worth. And what about the air conditioning on Spaceship Earth? Some of the best science we've got, then factored in with our economic projections in terms of our ability to transform our energy economies. This is what we call the Sea Road Simulator. This is saying that by the end of the century, we could see a 5 degrees Celsius increase on average temperature. You can see at the bottom of this that we're talking about a safety zone of between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius. So that blue line there, though, at 4.3, that's taking all of the countries that have pledged to reduce their emissions and saying this is the best that we can achieve with the current thinking and the current ideas underneath that. And if we then look at how does this distribute, what is the sort of the heat transfer across Spaceship Earth, you can see that, unfortunately you can't quite see the bottom here, but this is telling us that, for example, here in Australia, that we will see between 5 degrees and 7 degrees Celsius on average increase. But obviously in the Northern Hemisphere, you can see how much red there. We're talking between 14 and 16 degrees Celsius. This is a fairly serious heating issue that we might need to deal with. And at the same time, as what has enabled us to have this amazing flourish of mammalian flesh on the planet, or human flesh on this planet, has been access to that black stuff that I mentioned earlier that we dig up and pump up and set fire to and gives us such amazing energy. And we know now that we are at or close to that peak oil part of the curve where demand outstrips our ability to produce and everything is on the slippery downside. And we have to face up to the alternative energies that are significantly less energy dense and their energy return on energy invested is quite low in comparison. So we've had it pretty good for a long time. So there's a lot of ideas that we really need to challenge. This, and I will use the pointer here, because I'd like everybody to look at that number there. A lot of people are focused on the USA's current account debt, about 14.6 or so. This is just a rendering of those numbers. But what's really interesting is not what's on the profit and loss, but what's on the balance sheet of America. $115 trillion of unfunded liability to the American people. I think that makes it pretty clear that the capacity to pay for the futures that everybody's expected and feel entitled to needs to be questioned. So this gives us an opportunity, I think, to face up to some of these things and say, what are the ideas behind this? Are they still valid? Just like the picture here, we need to transform the way we're thinking and reimagine the world anew. And what I'd like to do is just take us through perhaps what some of those changes might be. It would be wonderful if we had one of these, by the way. I mean, Michael Leunig and his dark humour is just fabulous. From a mechanistic Newtonian view of the universe where everything's disconnected and humanity has just been placed in there, to a holistic worldview based on interrelationship and interdependency. Now, I'm sure many of you did maths at school, right? This is one of those other ideas that we can continue to grow forever without limits, right? The exponential growth curve. I think the great Professor Albert Bartlett from University of Colorado says, if there was one thing he'd change, it would be to ensure that every human being on this planet fully understands the exponential growth function. So from that, maybe it creates the propensity to take advantage of that growth. Okay? A wonderful picture from Monty Python. Instead of dynamic balance, where we look at steady state operating systems. There is a worldwide movement to look at global economics as a steady state model rather than a perpetual growth model. If you're interested, look up the website CASI, the Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. From a virtual economic and financial system that creates money as debt in a fractional reserve, an interest-bearing debt economy that must continue to grow, to a real economy that is organised around the production of useful goods and services, from managing symptoms, where we just treat the overlying issues, never really get underneath them, to real root cause. Now, going back to that F-111 aeroplane, if there was a major issue, we would always go back and find out what is the root cause. How do we ensure that we can restore the airworthiness of that aircraft and put it back safely into the air? We need to think about this as Spaceship Earth as well. The idea of ownership and entitlement, treating the planet as a Bunnings store and a Coles supermarket, and so long as I've got $50 in my pocket, I'll have whatever I want, thank you, without ever truly examining the consequences of those decisions. To creating unique relationships that understand that we're all together in this. This is one of my favourite slides. This is in some respects, the mantra of the modern MBA. Efficiency, efficiency, efficiency. Everything just in time. Manage it so that we're pushing everything to the margin. Instead, how about we look at safety margin and diversity? From hyper-complex systems where just pulling out one of those little straws and then we have the whole thing collapse, to resilient systems. Resilient systems built on diversity, built on modularity, where parts of the system can fail but the whole system doesn't collapse. Safety margin, as I mentioned before, but also having feedback mechanisms so that when we do something, we see the results of those quickly and then can choose to change if necessary. From exploitation and domination, where we treat people and the planet as disposable, to partnership and respect-based arrangements. From crisis management, reactive crisis management, to proactive design and prevention. I think everybody will get a feel for this. Anybody who'd sort of kept an eye on what was going on in Victoria in 2009. From monocultures and specialisation, where we become so hyper-efficient that we fail to understand all of the consequences of those activities, to perhaps a more holistic approach, where we take advantage of the systems of nature to teach us. Permaculture is a particularly great example of that. That is a design system for sustainability. From globalisation, once again, where we don't factor in all of the externalities, to local living economies, where we produce and work and get to know each other locally. From being a destructive force on this planet. This is from an island in the Pacific called Midway, and this just gives an indication of, seabirds dead on this island with all of that rubbish, our rubbish, inside them. Two more restorative practices, as we can see on this side. We're not talking about erosion, we're actually talking about restoring and rebuilding the vitality. From selfishness, the atomized individualist society, to service. From a hypermasculine society, and I don't just mean men, I mean the general direction of our systems, to the nurture and responsibility of a more feminine approach. From probabilities, where we look at counting up every possible permutation, to possibility, where we make a choice to say that's where we're heading and we're going to stick with it. From mutually assured destruction, talking about the Millennium Development Goals again, to mutually assured security. From hyperactivity and frenzy, and I think everybody will sort of perhaps feel a bit of this, and this is just a day at work, trying to navigate the complexity of any day at work, where it's difficult to make decisions even at the top, where we're looking at those critical instruments, perhaps to an eldership that really is earthbound and gives us an opportunity to reflect on our journey so far. Maybe this is time for a new language, a new way of understanding, communicating, and designing in sustainability in the ways that nature does. One thing's for sure though, and this is the reason for this mutiny of ideas, doing the wrong thing more correctly only makes things worse. Time for a big change. Now, if you'd bear with me, I'd just like to read a little poem, and hopefully I won't get too emotional about this. This is from a friend of mine, Drew Dellinger from San Francisco, if I can remember the words. We're standing on a planet that is shooting through space, and it's time we acted like it. Imagine nations with freed imagination. Imagine nations with freed imagination. It's time for she who sees the way, to seize the day, seize the hour, seize the levers of power, and be the change. Globalise liberation, planetise the movement. We can't stop the Earth's revolution. Thank you very much.